So let's start with the Berlin peace talks. We've kind of covered the point U.S. peace talks between supposed peace deal that they were trying to broker between supposedly Ukraine and Russia, but really it's the U.S. empire and Russia. We talked about that a few weeks ago. It was a very controversial clip. But here's a little bit of an update, right? So can you tell us what happened this week in Berlin with the peace talks and the continuation of those agreements?
Yeah, it's actually a bit of a continuation of what we've been talking about, right? And it's absolutely flabbergasting to me, the European perception on this NATO war with Russia, using Ukraine, both sides using Ukraine as a battleground. And it's even more shocking, the Ukrainian perception of their own war. But I was talking to people in Spain last week. I was in Spain, and I was talking to people who were heavily involved in Sanchez government, which is a left-wing government in Spain, and one which is at least economically succeeding. And their perspective on the Russia war is if they were NATO, they need to protect themselves against an imminent Russian invasion. They feel entitled to meddle on Russia's affairs and remove Putin. They feel genuinely entitled to remove Putin from power, to remove anyone that doesn't fit the European agenda. And I think it's just so impressive that this natural entitlement to choose who is going to govern a land that they aren't theirs. I have to say, out of coherence and out of my anti-imperialist beliefs, Ileana, that if Bolsonaro is in power, I don't want the Americans to come in and remove him to install whatever democracy they are proposing. It's our fight as Brazilians to fight against our own dictators or against our own lack of democracy, but it's or a lack of whatever fundamental rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to really state here that a lot of this is propaganda. So, for example, if Bolsonaro was to be the leader to, for some reason, get elected again in Brazil, we know anyway that these types of genuine authoritarian, these genuine fascist right-leaning types are useful puppets for the US empire. So most likely will be US backed anyway. They're not going to actually want to regime change someone who is so useful to them, you know? So that's kind of the
I mean, they will be very helpful until they aren't, because even they could probably not follow the agenda of the hegemonic North. And once they break with that, they are no longer useful. And of course, you know what is the plan for Russia? I'm going to get into that. Well, we've seen this week. We saw this week, the US, how they talk with Ukrainian and European leaders. I think already is a stretch to say Ukrainian and European leaders in Berlin, and for what they call a potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And after this, the US negotiations led by Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they said they will take the proposal to the Russians. And they call this a Berlin peace talks, which actually I think, an insult to our intelligence. The focus here is security guarantees that the US and Europe would offer Ukraine as part of a future peace deal with Russia. They both enter into this war. They heavily overestimated their sphere of influence, what they could achieve, and now they were trying to get out of this because it no longer makes sense for them. And so they're proposing, I'm going to read exactly what the EU and the UK leader, Keir Starmer, they made a joint statement with their promise, with their security promises to Ukraine. So this is here what they are ready to offer. And then we're going to break down this. So they say they would want to offer to Ukraine a European-led multinational force to support Ukraine armies and defend its skies and seas. Second, a legally binding commitment from the UK and all the European nations to take measures to restore peace and security in the case of a future armed attack. European support for Ukraine's ascension to the EU. Sounds like a pretty empty promise. European support for the ascension, either the European accepts Ukraine or doesn't accept the Ukraine. So I think this is just a fake here. And then a sustained and significant support from Europe to help Ukraine build its armed forces, which should remain at peacetime a level of 800,000 troops. 800,000 troops. A US-led ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism to provide early warning of any future attack, and investments in Ukraine reconstruction, which may include Russian sovereignty assets that have been frozen in the Eurozone, stolen by the Eurozone. So basically what we have here is a surrogate to NATO Article 5 Mutual Defense Pact. If you attack Ukraine, we'll attack you back. Ukraine is like almost a pseudo part of NATO, which is the very reason why this war first started. So they are trying to achieve a peace. The remedy is actually the illness. So they are trying to achieve the peace pact by pushing for the very problem that caused this war. So the World Socialist website, they characterize this as a war summit, and I think they couldn't be more right. It's not about peace negotiations. It's about powers doing everything they can to create a global position by military means in the Ukraine. Yeah, it's not leading away from militarism, but it's a struggle, an imperial struggle. So if you think that the Berlin Declaration is talking about 800,000 soldiers in peacetime, they are actually making Ukraine the largest military hub in Europe, heavily armed, highly equipped, fully integrated into NATO structures. So it's basically an incursion, without naming it, of Ukraine in NATO. This is the very problem that generated this conflict. You know, this is the core reason that produced the war in Ukraine. And it was NATO pushing closer and closer and closer to Russian borders, and fully integrating the region into NATO structures. So it is, I would say, it feels like a war declaration, a perpetuation of war. And I think it's very interesting as well. I think Vijay Prashad was mentioning that every time another country talking about ceasefire in Ukraine, and they branded this as Russian talking points. And I've met Brazilian main leader negotiation with the Kremlin and with Ukraine, Celso Amorim. I met him 2 years ago, and the Brazilian Commission was going to Russia and to Ukraine to talk peace with them. We're talking about one of the most seasoned and the most important diplomatic man in Brazil. He is political advisor to Lula and has been for years to Brazilian governments. He's internationally awarded. He is, I think, one of the main diplomats, world recognized, and he was pushing for this. And the North Atlantic's inherence of colonialism and racism will never accept that any country of the BRICS would break this peace deal. And it's very clear why, because this is a colonial partition over Ukraine. We have Trump making deals out of everything. He called the Ukraine deal that we talked about last 2 weeks ago as a venture this is explicit language to call a peace deal a venture. It is business venture. The same in Congo that he's doing now, the same in Palestine. They don't understand, Europe seems not to understand that Trump is going to break business deals for himself, or who else he wants to benefit in land which they're devastated and devastated through the Americans' own making and Europe's own making. So they come, they destroy, and then they offer peace deals where it looks like much more like a colonial partition, you know.
I mean,
And
I think it's important to clarify a lot of the language around the propaganda. So first of all, NATO is definitely a war alliance. It's never been a defense alliance. It's always been
exactly,
an entity of the Cold War. And again, imperialism against communism. That's the crux of the Cold War.
yeah.
But in terms of this particular moment in time, it's really more of imperialism against sovereignty. I think that's like the slight distinction that we can think of when we think of the Cold War, because otherwise people just get very confused. And we're just like, it's imperialism against communism. So NATO is a tool of US imperialism. Ukraine is a proxy of the US empire's expansion towards Russia, because Russia is showing itself to be a sovereign country. And it's really the same sort of playbook. I think what's interesting, though, is that the national security strategy, which we will be getting into with KJ No, we do talk a little bit about how there seems to be a contradiction, right? There seems, in theory, it's a false contradiction. This is a false propaganda contradiction between Trump supposedly wanting peace with Russia, while Europe escalating for war, continuation of war with Russia, while at the same time, the national security strategy shows that the US wants to, quote unquote, share the burden of basically imperialism. But what they mean by that is just that they want other countries to be paying for the war as well. They want the other countries to increase their military budget. And how are European countries going to justify increasing military budget at a time of great austerity and disparity of wealth? By creating a threat, a credible threat to the population. And China is too far away. And sure, like, they are trying to make it seem like China is very scary. There's certain things that they can use against China. They talk about freedom of speech, they talk about surveillance, they try to make people scared. But the fact of the matter is, we know, and we'll maybe be talking about Palestine action later on at the end of this, after we bring on KG No, but we know that our civil liberties have been rolled back. So we know that our freedom of speech is not genuinely there. We know that we're being surveilled. So I think those sort of suggestions that China is uniquely scary is maybe not really working that well here in Europe. However, Russia is just right here. Like, Russia.
Yeah, and absolutely, Ileana, I couldn't agree more. I think Russian, especially in the German subconscious, is a place that you fight against. It's imminent, historically imminent, and it's so natural for them to see Russia. Russia is their natural enemy historically. And I think, like, talking to Europeans, I have been a bit away, and I think in the UK things are a little bit different, not in this sense. They are extremely Russophobic, but Europe in general, natural enemy, and is so intricate. It's even the left cannot see through their imperialistic views of it. And one thing I think it's very scary, we saw the Bundeswehr, while German military leak by the Washington Post in our last show, and it's they talk. They don't want a peace agreement with Ukraine because they think Russia could gain time, and Russia would be the winner. They think they will be better off with a perpetual war and having Ukraine as the zone of influence. And now we've seen we have two forces, hegemonic forces in dispute over territory, over agreement. It's just like they see Ukraine as their inheritance, and they want to share it, and they want unequally share the burden of their strategic stupidity, because if you go here in Germany, anywhere you go, the prices in Germany have escalated in such level. You see a poorer Germany, you see a poorer Spain, you see the prices have really increased massively. Germany used to be, in this sense, a very socialist country. You would go, you will always have a cheaper option of good products. No longer. Everything is 3 times more expensive here in Germany. And this is a problem for daily life.
So when you're saying that there's a dual hegemony, or which are you talking about, European hegemony against US hegemony here?
I think they're the European thing that they own Ukraine. They don't understand how subordinate they were towards the US. They think we are the old empire, you are the new empire. We have it's ideologically, it's ideological fantasy they have here. So they really still think they are the colonizers of the world. So they're disputing.
I think the thing that's really interesting here is that the same exact dynamic is happening in the UK, although I would say that the UK is in the inner core of US empire.
Yeah.
It, however, is not a sovereign country. Like, if we think about, can the UK ever go up against the US? Absolutely not. The US is still the leader of the empire. That's without a doubt. Europe is in the second ring of empire. It is still within.
See that, Ileana. I think they don't see this through.
They don't.
They think they're acting at their own volition, defending their own interests.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, because I think often we've had conversations with people too who might not think of imperialism in the same way. So they're kind of thinking of these different factions, you know, that are just fighting for power, without understanding that the framework that they're operating in is very small. They're not really thinking about the entire world. They're not thinking about the global south. They're not thinking about the countries that are outside of empire. So they just assume that everyone is just fighting for,
and Europeans assume they are in the center of the world, whatever happens. Right. And I think they fail to see how they are subject to the US. They think the US subordinates all the countries and they are equal forces, symmetrical forces with the US. I think it's just so delusional to observe how they don't understand how they're being used, how they have hijacked their own sovereignties in the fantasy to be something better. And it's interesting because I think this war deal, not really a peace deal. Zelensky, he already said that, I don't want NATO troops on the ground helping to defend the country. And Russians are very seasoned. They already said they will not accept NATO countries in the Ukraine as a occupied territory, heavily military occupied territory. You know, and I don't think Ukraine doesn't agree to cede its sovereignty territory into invading army. You know, even Ukraine is against. So I don't know why it's being so widely celebrated in the news. And let me tell you something to our viewers. Let's put this on a colonial perspective, non-colonial perspective, or anti-colonial perspective. Let's go back to history. We can't ignore to see history here. We have a historical context. What Europe shares the concept of spheres of influence. It has deep colonial roots. You saw this appearing in the 19th century, also in a Berlin conference. Look how coincidental, also in a Berlin conference, where Europe colonial empires formalized rules to carve up Africa. So it's one of the most consequential and devastating events in Africa history. You have essentially a meeting where European policymakers and powers sat around the table and divided up an entire continent among themselves, without a single African representative present. So we were looking for African goods and natural resources and dividing among them. What happened is that 5 years later, this agreement, 90% of Africa territory colonized. Before that, we had 80% of Africa under traditional and local control. What is the difference between Africa and Ukraine here? Can anyone point it out for me? You know, we have also, but here we have a difference. One difference we do have. We have a multipolar context fully ignored. You know, the global south calls for ceasefires, negotiation through platforms like BRICS. They're systematically ignored and dismissed, and if not, who knows, maybe sabotaged. Yeah. And another here we have, what is the problem? Russia is not Africa. And NATO expansion is unacceptable for a sovereignty country. And this is the cause root. You know, so the crisis stems from NATO eastward expansion, breaking all post-Cold War promises. When Bush came into power, he made sure, the first George Bush, he removed each single diplomatic agreements of post-World War. It's a military escalation step by step, which Europe fully participates. And it's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy at the highest level, because when Russia entered the UK in 2022, the United States was doing airstrikes over Somalia, Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, Israel struck Syria and Palestine, all with European and US help. Who are they to ask anyone to abide by the rules they systematically breached? You need to come with clean hands. If you want to appeal for international rules, to freeze Russian assets, to say Russia's an invader, to say Russia this, you need first to ignore history. And what they have been doing is not only ignoring history, but they've been ignoring international law themselves. Why they can claim international war if they never followed it? You know, so it's very interesting, this very selective, this very selective is hypocrisy at the highest level. Ileana, I know you have a NATO-Russia military comparison. You have a table for us here. It's a good illustration.
I just wanted to show this because, I'll just show the source actually, because one thing is this rhetoric that Russia is going to invade Europe, I just think is very, very farcical.
It's absolutely farcical.
Yeah, so this is just the article, and then I made a chart from it. But essentially, when you look at the discrepancy between NATO, because NATO is 32 countries, I believe. It's over 30 countries. I think it's 32 countries now. And so Russia is one country. And this idea that Russia is going to go around and invade the whole of Europe is so irrational. Like, first of all, why would Russia do that? That would be so stupid. It would be a level of stupid that I don't believe.
I feel offended. I feel intellectually offended with this type of arguments. Come up with something better.
Yeah, exactly. Come up with something that is less just. But the thing of it is, we say that, and yet at the same time, how many situations have we, like you said, how many conversations have you had with people that genuinely believe that Russia is some sort of threat?
I think every European I've talked to think like this. The propaganda, if there is one successful propaganda at the heart of everything, I think are we still talking? Yeah. So I think it's definitely the anti-Russia propaganda. It's like we've never left the Cold War. We Europeans.
I think the Cold War has definitely evolved, but it's still the elements are still in place. The genuine sort of tensions and opposition of the Cold War is still in place. And you can see here just to look at like the active military personnel, NATO is 3.4 million, the aircrafts, and then also the defense spending. We have $1.47 trillion versus $120 billion in Russia. But we're supposed to believe that we have to continue to increase military spending. Like, does that make sense? You're already like over 10 times Russia's military budget, but somehow we are supposed to believe that we need more money. Like, how does this make sense? It's just completely farcical. So
yeah, and I think Germany always saw Russia, not Russia, but the countries around Russia, the former Soviet Union countries, at their sphere of influence. And in fact, if you go to those countries, you have the German industry. You know, you don't have local industry. You have DM, Deutsche Drogeriemarkt, Rossmann. You have all the German brands setting foot in that. So this is their colonial sphere of influence. But it was completely stupid because their ideology betrayed themselves. It got in the way of pragmatic and rational thinking. The German industry now to produce anything is 2-3 times more. Who is paying the price? It's us. It's us when we go to the supermarket. It's us when you go somewhere else. But the story they made up for people, it's not the Russian sanctions. It's not because we are buying Russian gas through India, much more expensive. It's because we are. It's because we have the migration. The migration is ruining the country. Let's get rid of the migrants. That's the problem here. It's multiculturalism in Germany. That's the problem of Germany, because we're not so pure as you used to be. We don't have control of our country. It has nothing to do with neoliberal policies and absolute concentration of wealth, you know, and it's crazy how people can be so irrational when they have a belief of superiority. Everything seems to justify it. And I think this is a core problem even of the left in Europe. They need to start thinking and look around. You can't tell a story from your own little world. You need to see things from different perspective, not a monocle, but a prism of event. The world is so big, so many culture, richness around us, but you insist to believe that your culture is the right one. And that seems to justify crazy things, even the militarization of Europe. Not long time ago, Ileana, they were fighting each other in a vicious war, in two vicious wars.
This is the thing about imperialism. It is not a natural state. Like, nobody would agree to this type of subjugation under imperialism, and the end goal of imperialism is just more power, more expansion, more growth. You know, it cannot, there's no way to have a stable, peaceful world under that sort of very narrow goal setting. You know, they don't care about any other metric.
No.
But that. So it's a failing project, and we can see that across the board.
So in Germany, they are now, you know, like the military, you're not obliged to go, it's not mandatory to go to the military in Germany. People have a decision, they could go and do social services, do something good for society. When you reach the age of 18, you can either say, I want to go to the military, or I want to help older people get by, I want to do. But now the German parliament is trying a new law to make this mandatory. Yeah. And they are saying, we want peace, but if we go to war, we'll go to war. And we're going to take everyone with us. You know, your son, your grandson, your brother, your whoever. We're going to take into this senseless war. And it was beautiful because a lot of the young German in the streets to a protest and say, we don't want a militarized society. We're increasing, being drawn towards, we don't need that defense. So we need to count on the consciousness of the new generations to see how senseless and self-destructive, nevertheless, it's not only towards other people, you destroy your own culture with this type of thinking. And I'm going to give you another example. UK, we've seen here in one of our shows how Keir Starmer took money out of environment to pump up the defense budget. And not only that, because he always has an element of deceitfulness. He pretended that UK had a budget of 11 million pounds for for the environment by cooking the books. He was rebranding different funds as an environment fund to create the appearance. When they had 2 billion, he created appearance to have almost 12, while extracting money from the environment, our most urgent problem of humanity today, to put it on defense, to make Britain great again, Little Britain great again.